In 1895, in the East London district of Plaistow, a foul smell seeping from a terraced house on Cave Road would uncover a crime so unnatural it would forever be known as the Plaistow Horror. The summer was unforgiving, baking the cobblestones and brickwork of the city's East End. For days, the residents of number 35's neighboring homes had complained, whispering to one another about the strange, cloying odor that grew stronger with each passing hour. Some dismissed it as the typical stench of London in July, a grim cocktail of coal smoke, uncollected waste, and the nearby River Thames. But as the odor intensified, seeping through floorboards and poisoning the air in their own kitchens, a deeper, more primal fear began to take root. This was not the smell of refuse. It was the smell of decay. Emily Harrison Coombes, the sister-in-law of the woman who lived at number 35, had tried to visit twice before. Both times she had been met at the door by her young nephews, 13-year-old Robert and 12-year-old Nathaniel, who offered polite but flimsy excuses. Their mother, they claimed, was away visiting relatives, but Emily knew her sister-in-law. A devoted and meticulous woman, she would never leave her sons unattended without a word. On the morning of July 17th, her patience exhausted and her anxiety mounting, Emily Harrison returned. This time, she was not alone. She was accompanied by a neighbor, Mary Jane Burridge, a woman whose own suspicions had been festering for over a week. Together, they were determined to get answers. They were prepared for illness, perhaps a sudden accident, but they could never have prepared for the truth that lay waiting behind the locked bedroom door. When the two women knocked on the door of 35 Cave Road, it was Robert, the elder son, who answered. He repeated the now familiar story. His mother was away. But his composure, once seen as precocious, now seemed unnervingly practiced. Emily Harrison would not be turned away again. She and Mrs. Burridge pushed past the boy and into the narrow hallway. The stench hit them immediately, a thick, suffocating wave of putrefaction that clung to the air. The small house, which they knew to be impeccably kept, was in a state of disarray. Curtains were drawn tight against the summer light, casting the rooms in a gloomy twilight. A man they recognized as a family acquaintance, a 39-year-old sailor named John Fox, was present, and he too tried to assure them that all was well. But his presence only deepened the mystery. The women's eyes scanned the untidy parlor, their senses overwhelmed by the foul odor that seemed to emanate from upstairs. Ignoring the boys' protests, Aunt Emily made her way to the staircase. "I must see my sister-in-law," she insisted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. At the top of the stairs, they found the master bedroom door was locked. Robert claimed they had lost the key. It was the final, desperate lie in a chain of deceptions that had held for 10 days. Refusing to be thwarted, Emily sent for the landlady, who arrived moments later with a spare key. The small group stood in silence on the cramped landing, the air thick with unspoken dread. The metallic click of the old iron key sliding into the lock was a sound that would haunt them forever, the sound of a terrible secret about to be unlocked. As the bedroom door creaked open, the smell billowed out, a physical force that made Mary Jane Burridge gag and stumble back, covering her face with her shawl. Aunt Emily, steeling herself, took a step inside. The room was dark, the heavy curtains blocking out the afternoon sun. On the bed, a figure lay beneath the sheets, but it was the stillness, the unnatural shape that froze the blood. With a trembling hand, Emily reached out and pulled back the linen. What lay beneath was a scene of pure horror. The body of Emily Coombes was in an advanced state of decomposition. The oppressive July heat had turned the sealed room into an incubator, accelerating the grim work of decay. Her remains were swollen, her skin blackened and discolored, and the corpse was swarming with maggots. Her features were almost unrecognizable. But it was not just the gruesome state of the body that spoke of a terrible end. At the foot of the bed, left in plain sight, was a long, dagger-like knife, its blade stained dark. Nearby, on the floor between the bed and the window, lay a heavy wooden truncheon. This was no peaceful death. This was a scene of brutal, deliberate violence. The two women recoiled, fleeing the room in horror, their worst fears confirmed in the most grotesque way imaginable. Downstairs, the boys and John Fox waited in silence, their faces betraying nothing. The illusion they had so carefully maintained for 10 days had finally shattered. The house on Cave Road was no longer a home, it was a tomb. And the truth of what had happened within its walls was about to spill out onto the streets of London. Panic and chaos erupted on Cave Road. A messenger was dispatched, and soon the first officer, Police Constable Robert Thwart, arrived at the scene. He ascended the stairs, his face grim as he entered the death room. Carefully, he pulled back the sheets and confirmed what the women had seen. He noted the position of the body, the presence of the knife, the abandoned truncheon. The scene was immediately sealed. Before long, the divisional surgeon, Dr. F.J. Kennedy, was summoned. Even through the severe decomposition, his expert eye could discern the cause of death. He would later testify that Emily Coombes had been killed by a single, decisive stab wound to the heart, a wound consistent with the dagger found on the bed. As the official investigation began, word of the grisly discovery spread through Plaistow. Neighbors clustered outside the police cordon, staring in disbelief at the ordinary terraced house that now harbored such an extraordinary secret. Reporters from the city's many newspapers descended, their pencils flying across notepads as they gathered details for the evening editions. The facts that emerged were as stark as they were incomprehensible. For 10 long days, 2 young boys had lived, eaten, and slept in the very house where their mother's body lay rotting upstairs. They had paid the rent, entertained a guest, and gone on excursions as if life were perfectly normal. The story was a sensation. Almost immediately, the press gave the case a name that would be printed in bold headlines across the country: the Plaistow Horror. The public was captivated, not just by the murder, but by the chilling question of how 2 children could live for so long with such a monstrous secret, their innocence a mask for something cold, calculated, and utterly terrifying. To understand the crime that would send a shockwave through Victorian England, one must first understand the family at its center. On the surface, the Coombes household at 35 Cave Road was the very picture of working-class respectability. The patriarch, Robert Coombes Sr., was a man in his late 30s, esteemed in his community as a diligent and sober provider. His role as a purser and chief steward for the National Steamship Company meant he was often at sea for weeks at a time, making the transatlantic voyage between London and New York. His long absences were a necessary sacrifice, ensuring a steady wage that kept his family housed, fed, and clothed. Before each journey, he would leave his wife with enough money to manage the household, confident that he was leaving his family in safe hands. That responsibility fell to his 37-year-old wife, Emily. By all accounts, she was a devoted mother and a fastidious housekeeper, the kind of woman whose home was always clean and whose manner was always pleasant. Neighbors and friends described her as cheerful and sociable, a woman who maintained the respectable order of her home amidst the grit and grime of East London. In the rigid social hierarchy of the late 19th century, where appearances meant everything, the Coombes family seemed to be a model of stability. They were not wealthy, but they were secure. They were not prominent, but they were respected. Yet behind the neat lace curtains of their terraced house, a dark current was flowing, one that remained invisible to the outside world until it was far too late. While the parents were regarded with respect, their 2 sons, Robert and Nathaniel, struck a discordant note in the neighborhood. They seemed to be cast from a different mold entirely, resembling neither their steady father nor their cheerful mother in temperament. Robert, the elder at 13, possessed a sharp and inquisitive mind that was undeniable. His teachers recognized his intelligence and his natural talent for music, but they also spoke of a startling arrogance and a dismissive attitude toward authority. He was precocious, but his cleverness was unsettling, paired with a cool detachment that seemed unnatural for a boy his age. His younger brother, Nathaniel, known as Natty, was just a year his junior but vastly different. Where Robert was animated and sharp-tongued, Nathaniel was sullen and brooding. Neighbors found him uncommunicative, a boy who rarely smiled and carried himself with a morose air. He had a reputation for dishonesty in small things, for telling petty lies and evading responsibility. Together, the brothers presented an uneasy front. They were not mischievous in the way of ordinary boys, they were secretive and sly. Whispers followed them down the street, that they were deceitful, that there was a coldness in their eyes. Many in the community attributed their strange behavior to their mother's leniency. Emily was seen as too indulgent, too gentle with her sons, unwilling to use the firm hand of discipline that was expected in a Victorian household. It was a common, charitable explanation. But what no one could have guessed was that this perceived indulgence was masking a pathology so profound it would soon lead to an act that defied all comprehension. On the 6th of July, 1895, Robert Coombes Sr. once again prepared to set sail from the London docks, boarding the steamship France bound for New York. The summer air was already thick with heat and coal dust. He kissed his wife goodbye, placed the household money in her hands, and left, assured that his family would manage as they always had. Within 48 hours of his ship clearing the English Channel, his domestic world would be irrevocably shattered. A key to understanding the coming horror lay in the single, all-consuming obsession of his eldest son. Robert did not just read. He inhaled cheap, sensationalist literature. In the late 19th century, a moral panic was brewing over the rise of penny dreadfuls. publications sold for a single penny, filled with lurid, illustrated tales of dashing highwaymen, ruthless criminals, and dramatic courtroom trials. To the respectable middle and upper classes, these magazines were poison. They were seen as a corrupting influence that glorified violence and lawlessness, turning impressionable young minds away from scripture and school lessons and toward the gallows. For Robert, these stories were not a casual pastime. They were a curriculum. He collected them, traded them, and spent hours lost in their pages. While other boys were playing cricket in the street, Robert was studying the methods of fictional detectives and memorizing the testimonies of fictional murderers. His fascination was not with heroism, but with the mechanics of crime and the drama of justice. And soon, he would seek out a real-world classroom for his morbid studies. Robert's obsession with crime was not confined to the printed page. In a move that demonstrated a startling and morbid precocity, he decided at just 12 years of age to witness the machinery of justice for himself. He learned of the sensational trial of a man named James Canham Reed, accused of a brutal murder that had captivated the city. On his own initiative, the boy traveled across London to the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey. He navigated the bustling city, found his way into the public gallery, and sat for hours among the grim-faced adults, absorbing every detail of the legal proceedings. He watched the barristers in their wigs, listened intently to the cross-examinations, and studied the face of the accused. For a child to undertake such a journey alone was remarkable. For him to choose a murder trial as his destination was profoundly disturbing. This was not the behavior of a normal, healthy boy. It was the act of a mind already fixated on the darkest aspects of human nature. To some, it might have been a sign of a brilliant, inquisitive intellect. But in retrospect, it was a chilling omen. What kind of child finds entertainment in the methodical dissection of a violent death? What kind of 12-year-old is drawn not to playgrounds or sweet shops, but to the cold, stone halls where men's lives hang in the balance? The experience seemed to solidify something within him. He had seen the theater of the courtroom firsthand, and the line between the sensational stories he read and the grim reality of crime had begun to blur in his mind. The penny dreadfuls had given him a script, and the Old Bailey had shown him the stage. In the early hours of July 8, 1895, just 2 days after his father sailed for America, the theoretical became terrifyingly real. Later, in police custody, Robert Coombes would recount the events of that night with a calmness that was, in itself, a confession of a deeply disturbed mind. His statement was not filled with panic or regret, but with a cold, sequential clarity. According to Robert, the evening began with a domestic conflict. His younger brother, Nathaniel, had been playing up, and their mother, Emily, had lost her patience and struck him. The punishment, though not uncommon for the era, sent Nathaniel into a bitter rage. He went to his older brother and in a fit of anger allegedly whispered the words that would ignite the tragedy. "I wish she were dead," Nathaniel reportedly said. "I would kill her, but I haven't the pluck. You do it." For most children, these would have been empty, angry words forgotten by morning. But Robert was not most children. A week earlier, he had taken a portion of his pocket money to a local shop and purchased a long, sharp, dagger-like knife. Too young to own such a weapon openly, he had hidden it, first in the dustbin outside, and later more securely in the chimney of the house. The weapon was ready. It was as if he had been waiting for a reason, a justification to act on the dark impulses nurtured by his readings. That night the reason arrived in the form of his brother's whispered request. A fuse had been lit. The brothers went to bed and Emily retired to her own room. But Robert did not sleep. He lay awake in the darkness, the house silent around him, the hours ticking slowly by. At approximately 3:45 a.m. he rose. In his confession he stated that he retrieved the hidden knife and walked silently into his mother's bedroom. She was not asleep. In the faint pre-dawn light filtering through the window, he saw her lying in bed, awake, with one hand raised to her face as if startled or attempting to shield herself. The detail is monstrous. This was not a swift, merciful attack on an unconscious victim. It was a confrontation. He knew she was awake, and she knew he was there. He stepped closer to the bed and with a single, deliberate motion drove the blade deep into her chest. The knife pierced her heart. According to his account, there was no struggle, no cry, only the quiet collapse of her body back onto the mattress, her hand still raised. He gave his statement as if relaying a simple, factual event. There was no mention of rage or passion, only the clinical details of time, place, and action. To the investigators who heard it, the complete absence of emotion in his telling was as horrifying as the act itself. Afterward, he covered his mother's body with the bedsheets. He left the knife on the bed and the truncheon nearby. He did not call for help. He did not run. Instead, he returned to his room and began the first day of his new, liberated life. What followed the murder was not the panic-stricken confusion of children left to fend for themselves, but a grotesque and meticulously orchestrated performance of normalcy. The 10 days that Robert and Nathaniel Coombes lived in the house with their mother's corpse would become the most infamous aspect of the case. A period of deception, so chilling it seemed to belong in the pages of one of Robert's own penny dreadfuls. On the morning after the murder, they rose, dressed, and left the house on Cave Road as if nothing was amiss. With the household money their father had left, they embarked on what appeared to be an idyllic summer holiday. That very afternoon, mere hours after driving a knife into their mother's heart, they traveled to Lord's cricket ground. There, amidst the roar of the crowd, they watched the legendary W.G. Grace, the most famous sportsman in England, bat in a county match. To any onlooker, they were just two ordinary East End boys enjoying a rare treat. No one could have possibly imagined the horrific secret they had left behind. This pattern of macabre leisure repeated itself day after day. They went to the theater, losing themselves in the drama on stage while a real-life tragedy decomposed in the room above them. They took a train to the seaside at Southend, breathing in the fresh, salt air. They attended local fairgrounds. Each outing was a calculated act of misdirection, a step further into a fantasy where they were free from parental authority, their gruesome secret locked away upstairs. While their days were filled with amusement, the boys also attended to the practicalities of their situation with a chilling pragmatism. When the weekly rent became due, Robert calmly handed the money to a neighbor, asking her to pass it along to the landlord. He explained that his mother was feeling unwell and was resting, and that he, as the responsible elder son, was taking care of the household duties. His performance was so convincing that the neighbor took the money without question. He even approached another resident and asked for a small advance of a few shillings, weaving a tale about needing it to pay for a doctor's bill for his ailing mother. These small acts of financial responsibility lent an air of credibility to their lies, keeping the neighbor's deepest suspicions at bay. It was during this period that they involved the 39-year-old sailor, John Fox. Robert, with his characteristic confidence, persuaded Fox that his mother needed money urgently and had authorized them to sell some household goods. Fox, either exceptionally gullible or willfully ignorant, agreed to help. He assisted the boys in taking items from the home to a local pawnbroker. More disturbingly, he stayed in the house for several nights, sleeping in a downstairs room while Emily's body lay just a few feet above his head. His presence would later be a point of intense scrutiny, though he was ultimately acquitted of being an accessory to the crime. All the while, the stench of death was growing stronger, a silent, creeping witness that could not be lied to or pawned away. With each knock at the door, with every concerned inquiry from a neighbor, Robert Coombes had an answer ready. His ability to spin elaborate, contradictory tales on the spot was nothing short of remarkable. To Mrs. Burridge, their closest neighbor, he explained that his mother had gone to Liverpool. She had been summoned by an urgent telegram, he claimed, to care for a relative who had suddenly fallen gravely ill. He delivered the story with such earnest detail that it seemed entirely plausible. For a few days it was accepted, but soon, when another neighbor pressed for information, the story changed. This time, Robert said his mother had traveled much further. An uncle in Africa had tragically passed away, he explained, and she had departed at once to handle the family's affairs. The tale was more dramatic, more exotic, and to some less believable. Yet, Robert's unwavering composure lent it a strange authority. When yet another resident commented on the worsening smell emanating from the house, he shifted the narrative again. His mother, he said with a casual air, had gone to visit a wealthy aunt in a much finer part of London. He even added a flourish, suggesting she might return with gifts for them all. He was a masterful improviser, tailoring his lies to his audience. He never appeared nervous or flustered. He delivered each fiction as if it were rehearsed, a performance of innocence that was both brilliant and deeply pathological. His younger brother, Nathaniel, was a less reliable actor. When questioned alone, his stories were inconsistent, and he often contradicted what Robert had said. It was Robert who was the architect of their deception, the calm, confident voice that kept the adult world at arm's length. But lies, no matter how skillfully told, have a finite lifespan. By the end of the second week, the carefully constructed facade around 35 Cave Road was beginning to crumble. The smell was now undeniable, a rank, pervasive odor that hung heavy in the summer air, forcing neighbors to keep their windows shut. The stories Robert told were becoming a subject of gossip and speculation. Liverpool, Africa, a wealthy aunt, The tales were too numerous, too dramatic, and too contradictory to be reconciled. Suspicion hardened into genuine alarm, especially among the women of the family who knew Emily Coombes intimately. Her sister-in-law in particular was tormented by doubt. Emily was not a flighty woman. She was grounded, responsible, and deeply attached to her sons. The idea that she would vanish for nearly 2 weeks without sending a single letter or message was unthinkable. It wasn't just the content of the lies that raised alarm. It was the unnerving ease with which they were delivered. Neighbors began to confer in hushed tones over their garden fences. Something was wrong, very wrong. The boys' strange, detached manner, once dismissed as youthful oddity, was now seen in a more sinister light. Their confidence seemed less like precociousness and more like a mask. The seeds of doubt, planted by a strange smell and watered by a river of lies, were about to break through the surface. The community's patience was wearing thin, and the women who loved Emily were no longer willing to accept the evasions of her clever, cold-eyed son. On July 15th, 8 days after the murder, Aunt Emily Harrison Coombes could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling that something was dreadfully wrong. Accompanied by her neighbor, Mary Jane Burridge, she made her first determined effort to breach the defenses of number 35. This time, they were met at the door not by the boys, but by the imposing figure of John Fox, the middle-aged sailor. He stood in the doorway, blocking their entry, and repeated the familiar refrain. Mrs. Coombes was away, and the boys were fine. His age and confident demeanor lent a superficial credibility to the story, and the women, though deeply unsatisfied, reluctantly retreated. They knew Emily. They knew she would never have left her home in the care of this man without a word to her own family. The encounter only deepened their fears. The foul smell that wafted from the house as the door opened and closed lingered in their minds, a scent that spoke of something far worse than a simple, unexplained absence. 2 days later, on the 17th of July, their patience was gone. The stench had become unbearable, a public nuisance that could no longer be ignored. Aunt Emily and Mrs. Burridge returned to Cave Road, their expressions grim and resolute. This time there would be no excuses, no turning back. They were not just neighbors making a polite inquiry. They were women on a mission, driven by a powerful intuition that a terrible crime had been committed, and that the truth was being guarded by 2 children whose innocence had long since curdled into something monstrous. The final confrontation was short and decisive. Robert once again stood at the door, his practice stories ready, but the women's faces were masks of grim determination. They pushed past him, their senses assaulted by the wall of stench inside. John Fox tried to intervene again, but his authority had evaporated. The women were now in control. "Where is my sister-in-law?" Aunt Emily demanded, her voice echoing in the stuffy, silent house. She marched toward the stairs, Mrs. Burridge closed behind her. The boys' final line of defense was the locked bedroom door. "It's locked," Robert stated flatly. "We can't get in." But the lie was too thin, too late. The refusal was an admission of guilt. As their voices rose, neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the escalating drama. The boys looked cornered, their composure finally cracking under the pressure of 2 resolute women who would not be deceived. Aunt Emily turned, and without another word to the boys, went to fetch the landlady. Minutes later, she returned, clutching the spare key. It felt heavy in her hand, like the key to a crypt. She ascended the narrow staircase, each creaking step amplifying the tension. At the top, on the small landing, she paused, exchanged a knowing, fearful glance with Mrs. Burridge, and fitted the key into the lock. The quiet persistence of these women, born of love and suspicion, had succeeded where casual inquiry had failed. They were about to force the truth, in all its horror, into the light of day. The moment the lock turned and the door swung inward, the full, horrifying truth was revealed. The discovery of Emily Coombes's body transformed the quiet terraced house into the epicenter of a media frenzy and a complex police investigation. But as constables and detectives swarmed the property, it was the demeanor of the 2 young boys that proved to be the most chilling evidence of all. While their aunt and neighbor recoiled in shock and grief, Robert and Nathaniel stood by, their faces impassive. They did not cry. They did not confess in a torrent of guilt-ridden panic. They simply watched, detached, as the grim proceedings unfolded around them. Their indifference was so profound, so unnatural, that it disturbed the hardened police officers more than the gruesome scene upstairs. When questioned, Robert's composure was unbreakable. He was calm, articulate, and seemingly unconcerned. This was not the terrified reaction of a child caught in a nightmare. It was the cold poise of someone who had long since made peace with his actions. As the body was removed and the house was searched, the story that began to emerge horrified the nation. The press dubbed it the Plaistow Horror, a name that captured not only the brutality of the crime, but also the psychological terror of its aftermath. The 10 days of games and lies, lived out in the shadow of a decaying corpse. The locked door had concealed more than a body. It had concealed the death of childhood itself. The question was no longer simply what had happened, but who these two boys truly were. In a small, airless room at the local police station, away from the chaos of Cave Road, Robert Coombes gave his confession. He did not stammer or hesitate. With the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to describe a game of cricket, he told the detectives what he had done. "I stabbed her," he said plainly, "in the chest." He then added the detail that would complicate the case for years to come. He claimed his younger brother had incited him. According to Robert, after their mother had beaten Nathaniel, the younger boy had begged him to carry out the murder, claiming he lacked the pluck to do it himself. When Nathaniel was questioned separately, his story was entirely different. He vehemently denied having any part in the murder plot. He insisted he had been asleep when the crime occurred and knew nothing until it was over. Investigators were faced with an impossible dilemma. Was Robert telling the truth, shifting blame onto his brother? Or was Nathaniel lying to save himself, a co-conspirator posing as an innocent? The truth of that conversation, if it ever happened, remained locked between the two of them. But what was not in dispute was Robert's cold calculation. He admitted that after the murder, he had tried to mask the growing odor of decomposition by sprinkling chloride of lime, a caustic disinfectant, over his mother's body. This single act was damning. It demonstrated not only a clear understanding that what he had done was wrong, but a conscious, premeditated effort to conceal his crime. This was not the work of a child acting on a fleeting, insane impulse. It was the work of a mind that was lucid, methodical, and terrifyingly clear. As detectives searched the boys' bedrooms, they found what Victorian society would quickly seize upon as the definitive explanation for this unnatural crime. Strewn across the rooms were stacks of penny dreadfuls. Their lurid, colorful covers depicted dramatic scenes of violence, betrayal, and courtroom justice. For the press and the public, this discovery was the missing piece of the puzzle. The Plaistow Horror was not an isolated act of familial violence. It was the inevitable result of a generation poisoned by sensationalist literature. A full-blown moral panic ensued. Newspaper editorials thundered against the pernicious influence of these cheap magazines. "See what becomes of our youth when left to the poison of the penny dreadful," one prominent paper declared. Preachers took to their pulpits, warning their congregations that such stories were gateways to sin and damnation, capable of turning impressionable children into cold-blooded killers. Robert Coombes became the poster child for this cultural fear. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a victim of a corrupting industry that sold crime as entertainment. This narrative offered a kind of comfort. It was easier to blame an external influence, a stack of magazines, than to confront the deeply unsettling possibility that a 13-year-old boy could, of his own accord, harbor such a capacity for calculated violence. The focus shifted from the psychology of the boy to the pathology of the books he read. In the public imagination, the knife in Robert's hand was less frightening than the stories that had supposedly put it there. The penny dreadfuls became a central exhibit in the court of public opinion, and they soon played a role in the actual courtroom as well. Both the prosecution and the defense used Robert's reading habits to frame their arguments. For the prosecution, his obsession with crime stories demonstrated a morbid and corrupted character, evidence of a mind that had become hardened to violence. For the defense, it was proof of an overactive imagination and a weak, impressionable nature, a mind so steeped in fantasy that it could no longer distinguish right from wrong, a key component of their budding insanity defense. The irony was that Robert himself seemed to find the connection laughable. When questioned about the influence of the magazines, he reportedly scoffed at the suggestion that they had driven him to murder, dismissing the idea as absurd. To him, they were just stories. But society needed a villain, and if the boy himself was too young and inscrutable, the books he read were a perfect substitute. The debate raged in the press for weeks. Parents across London confiscated their sons, magazines, and booksellers found themselves defending their trade against accusations of moral bankruptcy. The penny dreadfuls became a convenient scapegoat, a simple answer to a crime that was anything but simple. They allowed Victorian society to channel its anxieties about juvenile delinquency, class, and the dark allure of crime into a crusade against cheap literature, neatly sidestepping the far more terrifying questions about the nature of evil itself. The case was first heard at the West Ham Magistrates' Court, where the initial question was not one of guilt, but of culpability. Under English law, specifically the Children's Act of 1889, there was a legal principle known as doli in capax, a presumption that a child under the age of 14 was incapable of forming criminal intent. However, this presumption could be rebutted if the prosecution could prove that the child knew their actions were gravely wrong. Robert's case would become a crucial test of this principle. All the evidence, the purchase and concealment of the knife, the elaborate lies told to neighbors, the attempt to mask the smell with lime, pointed to a boy who was fully aware of the wrongfulness of his deed. His demeanor in the preliminary hearings only reinforced the sense of his unnatural maturity. Witnesses described him sitting calmly in the dock, sometimes with a faint smile on his face, as the grim details of his mother's death were read aloud. He appeared less like a terrified child facing the fearsome power of the law and more like a detached observer, intellectually curious about the proceedings. He showed no remorse, no fear, no grief. It was this chilling composure, this profound absence of a normal emotional response, that would become the central enigma of his trial. The law was designed to judge actions, but here it was confronted with a state of being that seemed to defy all its assumptions about childhood and humanity. At the magistrate's court, a parade of witnesses built an irrefutable case. Neighbors recounted the boy's shifting stories. Police officers detailed Robert's calm confession. Dr. Kennedy presented his medical findings. With each piece of testimony, the path forward became clearer. The defense began to lay the groundwork for an insanity plea, hinting at Robert's strange behavior and morbid interests, but the evidence of a deliberate, calculated killing was overwhelming. The magistrates concluded that there was more than enough evidence to proceed. They formally committed Robert Coombes to stand trial for the capital crime of murder. The case was transferred from the local court to the hallowed, intimidating halls of the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey. The stakes were now raised to the highest possible level. At the Old Bailey, Robert would be tried as an adult. He would face a jury of his peers, a formidable prosecutor, and a judge with the power to sentence him to death. The prospect was staggering. A 13-year-old boy could be sent to the hangman's gallows. As the trial date approached, the nation watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Plaistow Horror was no longer just a shocking local crime. It had become a national spectacle, a case that would force Victorian England to confront its deepest fears about childhood, morality, and the nature of justice itself. The small, pale boy with the unnervingly calm eyes was now at the center of it all, his life hanging in the balance. On the 9th of September, 1895, the trial of Robert Coombes opened at the Old Bailey. The public galleries were packed, the crowd straining to get a glimpse of the boy who had become the most infamous child in England. They saw not a monster, but a small, neatly dressed 13-year-old who sat quietly in the vast, imposing dock, his feet barely touching the floor. From the very outset, his behavior was bizarre. When the clerk asked him for his plea to the charge of murder, Robert stood and in a clear, steady voice declared, "Guilty." A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge, Justice Lawrence, immediately intervened. A plea of guilty in a capital case from a child of 13 could not be accepted. He instructed Robert's counsel to enter a plea of not guilty on his behalf, allowing the trial to proceed. But the moment was telling. It was an act of profound indifference, as if the boy was unconcerned with his own fate, eager to dispense with the formalities and accept whatever consequence came his way. The prosecution methodically laid out its case, presenting the grim facts that were now familiar to the public. The purchase of the knife, the murder in the early hours of the morning, the chilling confession, and the 10 days of calculated deception that followed. The evidence was straightforward and damning. The real battle of the trial would not be over the facts of the crime, but over the state of the mind that had committed it. The defense strategy rested entirely on convincing the jury that Robert was not responsible for his actions due to insanity. Their first and most powerful witness was the boy's own father, Robert Coombes Sr., who had been recalled from sea duty. His testimony was heartbreaking. He described his son's birth as exceptionally difficult, requiring the use of forceps which had left a permanent scar on the boy's head. From his earliest years, the father explained, Robert had been plagued by debilitating headaches, fits of pain so severe they would make him cry out. He painted a picture of a child who had been marked by physical trauma from the moment he entered the world, suggesting a deep, organic injury to his brain. This testimony was vital. It shifted the narrative away from moral corruption and toward medical pathology. It offered the jury a tangible, physical explanation for Robert's otherwise inexplicable behavior. The family's doctor, Thomas Griffin, was called to the stand and corroborated the father's account. He confirmed the long history of severe headaches and other nervous complaints, lending medical weight to the theory that Robert's mind was unsound. The defense was carefully constructing an image of a boy who was not evil, but broken, a victim of a damaged brain that left him incapable of normal emotional or moral reasoning. The scar on his head became a visible symbol of the invisible wound within. The most crucial medical testimony came from Dr. George Edward Walker, the surgeon at Holloway Prison where Robert had been held since his arrest. Dr. Walker had spent weeks observing the boy. On the stand, he described Robert's effect as highly unusual. He was preternaturally calm, controlled, and articulate, even when discussing the brutal act of killing his mother. There was, Dr. Walker noted, a complete absence of the agitation, hysteria, or remorse one would expect from a child in his situation. To the surgeon, this unnatural composure was not a sign of a hardened, criminal nature, but a symptom of a disordered mind. He pointed to the forceps scar as potential evidence of a congenital brain defect that could have led to a form of moral insanity, a controversial but recognized diagnosis at the time, where a person's intellectual faculties remain intact while their moral and emotional senses are absent. Throughout this testimony, Robert sat in the dock, the living embodiment of the doctor's description. He listened politely, occasionally offering a faint, detached smile. He did not flinch when the murder weapon was presented as evidence. He did not weep when his own chilling confession was read aloud to the court. The stark contrast between the horrific violence being described and the placid, almost serene boy accused of it created a profound sense of unease in the courtroom. The jurors were faced with an impossible task: to look at this child and decide if his calmness was the mark of a monster or the symptom of a madness beyond his control. After all the evidence had been presented, the jury retired to deliberate. The tension in the Old Bailey was palpable. A guilty verdict without a finding of insanity would mean a mandatory sentence of death. The press had been speculating for days that Robert Coombes could become one of the youngest people ever to be hanged in British history. After some time, the jury returned. The foreman announced their verdict: guilty, with a strong recommendation for mercy. It was a compromise, an attempt to hold Robert responsible for the act while pleading with the judge to spare his life. But Justice Lawrence refused to accept it. The law demanded clarity. A recommendation for mercy was a plea, not a legal finding. He sent the jury back, instructing them to answer the fundamental question: was the boy sane or insane at the time of the killing? They had to choose. The jury filed out once more. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was absolute. The foreman stood and delivered the final, fateful verdict: guilty but insane. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the gallery. Robert Coombes would not hang. The verdict acknowledged that he had killed his mother, but it concluded that he was not legally responsible for his actions due to a disease of the mind. He had escaped the noose, but he had not won his freedom. His fate was now sealed, but it would not be a fate of his own choosing. The verdict of guilty but insane carried with it a unique and formidable sentence. Robert Coombes was to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. This was not a fixed prison term with a set release date. It was an indefinite sentence, meaning he would be confined until the authorities, specifically the Home Secretary, acting on the advice of doctors, deemed him cured and no longer a danger to the public. He could be held for years, for decades, or for the rest of his natural life. His destination was to be the most notorious institution in the country, Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. The name alone conjured images of high brick walls, iron gates, and the country's most dangerous and disturbed minds. The public reaction to the verdict was deeply divided. Many praised the jury's compassion, arguing that the medical evidence of a troubled mind made a death sentence unconscionable for a child. They saw it as a sign of a more enlightened and humane justice system. Others were outraged. They saw the verdict as a dangerous precedent, a weak-willed capitulation that allowed a self-confessed killer to escape the ultimate punishment. "What lesson is taught?" one furious editorial asked, "if a boy may kill his own mother and escape the rope?" For Robert, the legal arguments were irrelevant. At just 13 years old, he became the youngest inmate ever committed to Broadmoor. His childhood was officially over, traded for a life of institutional routine, locked away with men who were killers, madmen, or both. London had expected a hanging. Instead, it was left with an unsettling question mark. Broadmoor was a world unto itself. A sprawling, fortress-like asylum set in the Berkshire countryside, it was designed to be inescapable, a place to house individuals judged by the courts to be both criminally liable and mentally ill. When Robert Coombes passed through its gates, He entered a society of men whose delusions had driven them to acts of extreme violence. He was a boy among grizzled, unstable adults, yet remarkably he adapted. The boy who had been described as arrogant and defiant became a model inmate. The asylum's rigid structure, the strict timetables, the mandatory work assignments, the long periods of quiet observation seemed to suit his detached temperament. He caused no trouble. He followed every rule. He earned no punishments. For 17 years, he lived within those red brick walls. Doctors observed him, interviewed him, and wrote detailed notes, searching for the overt signs of madness that would justify his confinement. They found none. He displayed no hallucinations, no paranoid delusions, no violent outbursts. He was lucid, intelligent, and consistently calm. The very composure that had once been presented as evidence of his insanity now made him appear perfectly rational. It was a profound paradox. He was confined for being mad but acted sane. He learned trades, continued his musical studies, and quietly served his time, his inner world remaining as inscrutable as ever. His crime receded into the past, a single, violent aberration in a life that was now defined by orderly, monotonous compliance. In 1912, after 17 years of confinement, the authorities made their decision. The boy who had entered Broadmoor was now a 30-year-old man. The medical board, in consultation with the Home Secretary, concluded that Robert Coombes was no longer a threat to society. He was officially released. He did not return to the East London streets that were haunted by his past. The name Coombes was forever linked to the Plaistow Horror, and he knew he could never escape its shadow in England. Instead, he made a decision that would radically alter the course of his life. He left the country altogether, booking passage on a ship bound for Australia. Half a world away, he could begin again. He could shed his old identity and forge a new one. In the vast, sparsely populated landscapes of rural Australia, he found the anonymity he craved. He took up work as a laborer, moving between small towns and farming communities. He was quiet, hardworking, and kept to himself. No one knew his story. No one knew of the locked room on Cave Road, the trial at the Old Bailey, or the long years spent behind the walls of Broadmoor. The Plaistow Horror was a ghost that had been left behind in another hemisphere, a dark secret buried deep within the mind of a man who now simply wanted to live an ordinary life. But the currents of history were about to pull him into another, even larger vortex of violence. When Great Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, the call to arms echoed across the empire. In Australia, thousands of young men rushed to enlist, swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor. Among them was Robert Coombes. He joined the Australian Imperial Force, but not as an infantryman. Instead, he chose a role that would place him at the heart of the carnage, but without a rifle in his hand. He became a stretcher-bearer and later a bandsman, positions that required a unique and steady form of courage. In 1915, he was shipped to the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. On those blood-soaked beaches and cliffs under constant Turkish shellfire and sniper attacks, Robert's defining quality, his unnerving calm under pressure, found a new and noble purpose. As a stretcher-bearer, his job was to venture into no man's land, often in the midst of battle, to retrieve the wounded. He crawled through mud and viscera, ignoring the whistle of bullets and the crump of explosions, to reach fallen comrades. He lifted their shattered bodies, offered what comfort he could, and carried them back to the relative safety of the trenches. He was wounded himself on 2 separate occasions by shrapnel, but each time, after recovering, he returned to his duties on the front line. The boy who had taken a life with a knife was now risking his own, time and time again, to save the lives of others. It was a transformation so profound as to be almost unbelievable. In 1916, Robert Coombes's extraordinary bravery was officially recognized. He was awarded the Military Medal, a decoration for acts of gallantry and devotion to duty in the field. The citation noted his repeated courage under heavy fire, his tireless work in rescuing the wounded from perilous situations at great personal risk. The news of the award would have been printed in military gazettes, a small testament to one man's valor amidst the industrial slaughter of the Great War. To his fellow soldiers, he was a hero, a dependable comrade known as Bob. They likely knew nothing of his past. The name Robert Coombes, the murderer, had been washed away by the blood and sacrifice of the Dardanelles, replaced by Robert Coombes, the decorated war hero. The irony is staggering and deeply unsettling. The same hands that had once driven a dagger into his own mother's heart now bandaged the wounds of his brothers in arms. The same mind that had coolly orchestrated a 10-day deception now focused with disciplined clarity on saving lives in the chaos of war. Was this redemption? Had the years in Broadmoor and the horrors of the battlefield somehow purged the darkness from his soul? Or was it something else entirely? Perhaps his unique psychological makeup, his detachment, his lack of emotional response, his intense calm, made him uniquely suited to the grim work of a stretcher-bearer. He was a man who did not panic, a man who could function amidst horror. The battlefield had simply provided a new, socially sanctioned stage for his old, unnerving composure. After the war, Robert returned to Australia and settled in New South Wales, where he would live out the rest of his days in quiet obscurity. He became a farmer, working the land, and rediscovered his childhood passion for music. The man whose name was once a byword for juvenile depravity became a local music teacher, giving lessons to the children of his neighbors. Parents described him as a patient and gentle instructor, and he was a respected, if reserved, member of the small rural community. His most significant act in these later years, however, was one of personal salvation. He learned of a local boy, Harry Mulville, who was being neglected and abused by his family. Robert took the boy in. He gave him a home, cared for him, and effectively adopted him, raising him as his own son. For years, Harry lived and worked alongside Robert, learning music from him and receiving the stability and protection he had never known. In this single, profound act of compassion, Robert Coombes seemed to complete his journey from pariah to patriarch, offering a lost child the safety and care that had been so catastrophically absent in his own troubled youth. He died on May 7, 1949, at the age of 66. No headlines marked his passing. To his neighbors, he was simply Bob Coombes, an old soldier, a farmer, and a kind man who had rescued a boy in need. He left all of his modest possessions to Harry, the boy who remembered him only with gratitude and affection. The life of Robert Coombes presents us with a haunting and unresolved legacy. History offers us two irreconcilable portraits of the same man. There is the 13-year-old killer of Plaistow, the cold, detached boy who murdered his mother, lived with her decaying body, and fascinated a nation with his monstrous composure. Then there is the decorated hero of Gallipoli, the gentle music teacher, the compassionate guardian who rescued a child from a life of abuse. He was a murderer. He was an asylum inmate. He was a soldier. He was a savior. All of these things are true. His story defies any simple label, resisting our need to categorize people as either purely evil or purely good. It forces us to confront a more disturbing truth, that the capacity for both profound darkness and profound light can exist within a single human heart. Can a person truly be redeemed from such a monstrous act, or does the stain of it remain forever? Does a life of good deeds outweigh a single unforgivable sin? The archives of history offer no easy answers. They only leave us with the unsettling reality that the same hands that commit an unspeakable evil can also perform acts of incredible good. What do you believe defines a person, their worst act or their best? Let us know in the comments below. And if you find yourself drawn to the shadows of the past, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story buried in history's most macabre mysteries.